Hello and a very warm welcome to all of you. My name is Pratik and I'll be taking up the news today discussion for 10th June. So in the main news, we are going to cover 5 news. So the first news is about NHRC has expressed concern over digital arrest scams. In the second news, we will be covering IMI resistant mustard hybrids to increase crop yields. In the third news, we'll be covering the news on frequent disruptions in the legislature. Fourth news will cover India's infrastructure achievements. And in the fifth news, we'll be covering the influence of Indian ideas across the Southeast Asia. Then we also have certain quick updates as well. So let us start with the very first news, that is a concern that has been expressed by National Human Rights Commission over the digital arrest scams. And this topic is essentially part of your GS paper 3, where it is mentioned that you have to study about the basics of cyber security. Okay. Now, if you look at the news, what exactly the news is that NHRC has expressed concerns that many of the Indians have lost around 52,976 crore to the cyber-enabled frauds. Okay. So we'll discuss what exactly are the cyber-enabled frauds, and particularly 8% of these frauds belong to the idea of digital arrest. Okay. Now, why NHRC is covering this, or why NHRC is discussing this? Because NHRC has mentioned that digital arrest or the cyber-enabled frauds are not merely about financial problems, or it causes physical anxieties and emotional burden, but in essence, it is also a deprivation of human rights. Okay, so in this context, we will understand the idea of cyber-enabled frauds in general, and we'll also understand the idea of digital arrest in particular, and what are the measures that can be taken to address this. So first, let's understand the idea of cyber-enabled fraud. So cyber-enabled frauds are essentially those frauds which gets amplified because of the usage of information and communication technology, right? And there are certain basic examples or types of cyber-enabled frauds. The first one is business email compromise, where fraudsters impersonate clients or the suppliers through emails, and the purpose is to divert legitimate payments. Also, it can be used to divert payrolls or to provide some fake invoice, etc. So first type of cyber assisted or cyber enabled fraud is business email compromise. The second one is called phishing fraud. Phishing frauds are where the victims are tricked into providing their personal information, their banking information, their login credentials to their banks or any other important areas, and then they are used for financial theft. In this, what the fraudster do is that they pretend to be from certain important companies, right? And then they provoke the victims to share their identification, which then they are used to log in and take money from their account. The third one is impersonation fraud, where the criminals pose as the relatives, friends via phone or social media, and then they tend to extort money to gain influence or control over their accounts. And now this is also assisted by the use of AI and deepfakes. Then there are online investment or trading fraud, where the fake trading or investment platforms, they lure the victims into investing into non-existing schemes involving fiat or virtual assets. So we all know about the idea of pyramid scheme, right? So in a way, the cyber enabled or cyber essentially, it makes these online investment fraud much more larger in reach and scale. And then there are romance and employment scams, right? Where fraudsters exploit the emotional relationship or fake jobs offers to obtain money from the victims. Also, this leads to sextortion, right? So this is about cyber-enabled fraud, and among this, the most prominent one, which is gaining a lot of traction these days, is digital arrest. So now let's take a look into what exactly is the digital arrest scam. So it is a scam designed to extort money from the victims, and the purpose here is using method is used is fear, deceit, and intimidation. So this is the whole process, or the meaning of the term digital arrest. So what happens in digital arrest? Under this, the victims receive a phone call, or maybe they will get a video call from somebody impersonating a very high public official, such as a judge or maybe a police inspector or a custom officer, telling that the victim has been found guilty in certain heinous crimes, maybe about tax crimes, or about certain, their Aadhaar is linked to certain various endangered products, or for money laundering. So somehow they establish the guilt on the victim, and then they ask the victim to shut down everything and be present only in that room particularly, and not disconnect, right? So this is the way. And then further what they do is they play with their emotions, and they generate a lot of fear in them. So what it does, it creates a fear psychosis, and the victim, in order to avoid all such repercussion, what they do is they end up paying a huge sum of amount to these fraudster, right? And it is not just that people who are very cyber naive who get uh, who fell prey to these problems. The problem is that even people who have decent understanding of digital arena, digital ecosystem, also do not understand the whole approach, because what they do is, what the criminals do is that they create some sort of panic, and they prevent the victims from thinking rationally. Therefore the emotional response is evoked, and then they lure them into this thing. Then once the fund transfer happens, then it is spent into various mule accounts. Mule account essentially means that there are several accounts under which the fund is transferred, and then from the one account the fund is transferred to the next amount, and then it is the entire process of money laundering comes into effect. Therefore it becomes very difficult to take care of the digital arrest scam once it has been committed. Now in light of this, CBI had launched an initiative called Operation Chakra 5. So, and it was essentially working with the Interpol to gain information, intelligence on how these fraudsters utilize this process, right? So under this, a lot of intelligence was gathered, and then a lot of suggestions were made in terms of curbing the digital arrest scam. So first thing, in terms of the recommendation, one is that we need to recognize digital arrest scam as a distinct offense. Now this will ensure that the legal and the entire process related work will be fast tracked. The second important thing is that we need to criminalize the mule account, under which fund is transferred temporarily, and then from there the fund is distributed again into different account. But the fact remains that the mule account is, as of now, is not criminalized. Therefore we need to make sure that the mule accounts are also gets criminalized. Along with that, all the enablers as part of the digital arrest scam should also be criminalized. Apart from that, the OTT communication platforms such as WhatsApp, such as Instagram, everything should also be regularized to ensure that the cyber fraud mechanism do not arise. Second is important. So this is the preventive measure, something that we can take before a crime has been committed. Second is, once a crime has been committed, we should understand that this leads to a lot of mental and financial harassment of the victim. And to alleviate that, to address that, there has to be certain dedicated victim compensation fund that will ensure that at least they get certain part of their money back. And they should enable rapid freezing of fraudulent transactions during the golden hour. Golden hour means the period, very short period under which the transaction has happened from the victim's account to the fraudster or the mule account. And thirdly, there should be a single verification portal for the important public officials, because this helps in providing for a verification of the authenticity of all the law enforcement agents in fact, in terms of the police officers, judicial officers. So this will help in getting a good credentials, whether a person actually who pretends to be a police or a judicial officer is actually one or not. So these are the three measures that can be taken. Apart from that, we also have certain generic cyber security measures such as I4C, etc. But these measures are particular to the digital arrest scams. Now, UPSC has asked a lot of questions from cyber security, right? But it is yet to ask a question on digital arrest. But this you can directly or indirectly use in questions such as discuss different types of cyber crimes. So you can talk about different types of cyber crimes such as phishing, such as the business email correspondence, etc. And you can also write about the digital arrest, etc. And the measures required to be taken to fight the menace. You can talk about the existing mechanism, the institutional mechanism, the legal mechanism, and the way forward. In the way forward, you can talk about the fact that this is high time that we criminalize the digital arrest as a sole ground for arrest, etc. Right? So you can take some inputs from the current affairs that has happened. Let's now talk about the second news, that is about IMI resistant mustard hybrids to increase crop yield. Now, this topic is a very important one because it sits at the intersection of science and technology, because here you have to understand the concepts of biotechnology, and then you need to understand the application of biotechnology in agriculture. In fact, there is also some sort of application in economics as well, in terms of export, import, etc., trade deficit, etc. So this is a very important topic, and there should be clarity in terms of what exactly are some of the details which are mentioned here. So first thing that you should know is that India has to import the edible oil, the oil that we use for cooking, right? So we import them because we do not produce enough oil. And the problem with importing, is that it creates a lot of trade deficit. And now if you look at the data, India has spent around 1.6 lakh rupees or crore in terms of importing edible oil, and it is around 16 million tons that we have imported in 2024-25. So the problem is that we are importing a lot of edible oil, and what is the solution? The solution is indigenization, that we produce more and more edible oil in India itself, and the solution is mustard. So generally what we try to do is we tend to double down on mustard production. But the problem with mustard production is that there is a parasite. So there are a lot of herbs, the insects and parasites which retard or which reduce the productivity of mustard. And one of them essentially is very problematic for the mustard production in India because it attaches itself to the root of the mustard. And because of that, it leads to decline in production up to 30%. Now, this is very difficult to get rid of because it is under the ground. So under the ground parasites are very difficult to get rid of. Even with very high labor usages, it is very problematic. So what is the solution that we have adopted? So usage of biotechnology has been done. And then for that, I see this IMI enabled, or IMI is essentially a herbicide. This herbicide means that it kills this parasite. Okay, so it kills the parasite and it increases the production. This is through biotechnology. But the problem is IMI under the normal crops, what it does is it retards the production of an enzyme called or a hormone called ALS. So ALS is a growth hormone in the mustard plants or the mustard crops. So usage of IMI, that is the herbicide, to kill this parasite also retards the normal crops because it attacks the ALS enzyme. Okay. Now that is why now the recent cultivation of this IMI, that is Imidazoline resistant mustard has been now on setting on trial, and this is going to be the IMI tolerant version. So the IMI tolerant or resistant mustard hybrids will be created, and they will not be affected by the ill effect of IMI, which means that ALS or the growth hormone will not be impacted by this. And because of that, there will be three major benefits. There will be increase in yield or productivity. There will be less labor requirement will be there. So it will not lead to excessive labor requirement. And since it is a hybrid, it will also not have any adverse impact on the soil or on the environment. Remember, if you look at genetically modified crops, it has certain impact on the environment, plus there are other impacts which we cannot anticipate, right? So it's not that harmful, or it is largely uh, not that harmful for the soil or for the environment at large. So this is the major takeaway from this particular news. So let me give you some additional details about IMI resistant mustard. So it is developed, how it is developed? It is developed through a process called mutation breeding, in which scientists breed crops to preserve certain natural mutation. Mutation means changes, right? So here changes happens under certain parent genes and they are crossbred. Okay. The process is based on an enzyme called ALS, which is essential for plant growth. The normal plants IMI herbicides inhibit ALS enzyme, as we discussed, which disrupts growth and causes plant death. But the IMI resistant hybrids, it alters the ALS enzyme, it prevents the herbicide binding, right? So what are the advantages? It helps in weed management, and it creates lower labor dependence, and it enhances productivity. Now the name of the parasite is orobanch, and it is also known as Felipanch, right? So this is the name of the parasite that grows inside the roots of the mustard, right? And ALS is the enzyme, acetylolactate synthase, right? So this is responsible for plant growth. So just you need to know the whole mechanism and some name, etc. You can drop it while you write an answer. Now, how is it different from GM? How hybrids are different? So hybrids, as I discussed, it is developed by cross breeding the genetically distinct parents. And the idea is to combine the desirable traits so that the mutated offspring can prevent or can be beneficial in certain regard, maybe in terms of being resistant to certain climatic condition, etc., or tolerant to temperature ranges, etc. Right? When it comes to GM crops, it is developed directly by inserting or modifying the genes. So here, the genes itself is modified or inserted using the genetic engineering techniques. So here, there is a genetic or a DNA modification is being seen, right? For example, we have BT cotton, we have GM mustard, and the BT cotton gene is taken from a bacteria called Bacillus thuringiensis, right? And these are highly regulated. These genetically modified crops are highly regulated. It requires a lot of permission, lot of regulation due to biosafety and environmental concerns. On the other hand, the hybrids are not that problematic or not that dangerous, right? So this is all about the second news. Let's move to the third news. And before that, let's take a look into a question that came from this topic. And the topic was very generic. How can biotechnology improve the living standards of farmers? Okay. So the next topic is frequent disruptions in legislature pose a challenge to democratic institutions. So this statement was made by the Honorable Lok Sabha Chairman in a very important meeting that was happening in a conclave. And in this, the Lok Sabha speaker has talked about what exactly is the impact of the disruptions and what can be done to address it. So we'll just take a look at this and we'll understand what exactly are the key reasons why these disruptions keep happening and how we can overcome them. So this topic belongs to GS paper 2 polity, and from this also a question has come in the past in terms of the role of individual MP, right? So first of all, what exactly is a disruption? A disruption is when the house is not able to function, right? Because of there is a walkout, or some member starts using slogans, or they come onto the well of the floor, right? So basically, because of several disruptions in the house, the house is not able to function properly. And there are several reasons for that. Opposition parties claim that the government doesn't allow them to function properly, doesn't allow them time to put forward their viewpoint. Most of the time is hijacked by the government themselves. Therefore, the opposition use them as a ploy to help attract attention towards certain important matters. Secondly, the opposition parliamentarians also allege that many of the national importance topics are not discussed by the government. Therefore, they use certain tactics to draw attention to the people at large, right? So these are the key reasons for fueling the disruptions. Now let's talk about what exactly it leads to, or what are the impacts of these disruptions. So there are two ways in which we can look at the disruptions. One is the short-term impact, or we can say quantitative impact, and the second one could be the qualitative impact, or the procedure, or the substantive impact, okay, long-term impact. So in terms of the short-term impact or the quantitative impact, we can see that it leads to delay in the legislative business. Some important bill is to be passed, but because of disruption, it will not be passed. And the bill could be very important for national security. It could be very important for, say, some economic project, some important aspect for international relations. So it could be anything, right? So if it is not being passed, it delays legislative business. Secondly, there is loss of functional time. So the 17th Lok Sabha sat for just 274 days, with average number of sittings per year to be 55. So it leads to loss of the functional time. Then, so these two can be considered as the short-term impact or the quantitative impact. But then when it comes to the qualitative impacts, first one is that it leads to fewer institutional checks. Remember that when it comes to passing a law, largely the role is very limited with respect to parliamentarians. We generally think that parliament's job is to make law. But from Indian perspective, what happens is executive drafts the law, and the permanent executive or the civil servants, they make or they give shape to that law through subordinate legislation. And the role of the parliamentarians merely is to accept or reject the law and to debate on that. But what if there's a disruption? Then most of the time the bill is generally passed through a voice vote, or there is very limited discussion. So in a way, this leads to very limited check on the bills. For example, the farm laws were passed. They were subjected to very limited discussion. Therefore, it led to a lot of protest by the farmers. So and this has also led to increasing instances of judicial overreach, because now when the parliamentarians are not checking the efficacy, the constitutional limitations of the bill, then ultimately when the bill goes for judiciary for it a review, then most of the times judiciary take a very hard stance on it, and it resorts to ordinances. It leads to judicial overreach, and sometimes executive also takes the matter in its own hand and uses ordinance. They undermine the key functions of parliament. In fact, recently the executive appointed several judges through ordinance route. Then it has also led to weakening of the deliberative democracy. Deliberation basically means to discuss, to debate, to find about the impact of a certain bill on different stakeholders, right? So because of very little discussion over bills, in the 17th Lok Sabha, around 58% of the total 179 bills passed were passed within 2 weeks of their introduction, and 35% of them were passed with less than an hour of discussion. So this is a very startling data, which suggests that one of the primary function of parliament is to debate, to analyze, to check, and to scrutinize. And based on that, they hold the executive accountable. So the entire edifice of the parliamentary democracy stands on the importance of parliamentary debates, which has been compromised because of these disruptions. And finally, at the end of the day, what it leads to is that it leads to decline of the consultative spirit. So in the 17th Lok Sabha, only 16% of the bills introduced were referred to the committees, the parliamentary committees, losing an expert layer of scrutiny. So these are the impacts of the disruptions. Now, what can be done to address it? First, there can be a legislative committee of parliament, and the idea is that they will govern and cooperate legislative scheduling, right? So because presently the legislative scheduling is heavily dependent on the executive, and because of that the opposition feels that their voices are not heard, and therefore it is important that we have somebody where all the stakeholders are present and they can devise a schedule that is best for all the stakeholders. Secondly, there can be a meeting of all party business advisory committee to decide on weekly agenda through consensus. So the work of parliamentarians begin before the parliamentary sessions happen, right? So essentially what can be done is that a detailed schedule can be planned with consultation with all the parties so that there would be no scope of walkouts in the future. Apart from that, there's a very interesting practice in Britain that they set aside certain days for the opposition parties to talk about their agenda. And this practice can definitely be emulated by India as well, because most of the times in India, we have seen how many times the private bills have been passed or they have been even debated on. So it is important that certain days of the House can be given for the exclusive agenda of the opposition parties. And next, we can increase the sitting of the parliament for, as per the recommendation of the National Commission to review the working of the constitution. So essentially what it said, that the parliament, the number of sitting can be increased to up to at least 100 to 120 days. In fact, Law Commission of India has also made the same suggestion, right? So these are the measures. Let's talk about infrastructure. The fourth news. The fourth news is infrastructure creation supports India's transition towards modern integrated economy. And the news is picked up from PIB. So PIB has come up with a feature that talked about all the achievements that India has made under the infrastructure realm. And infrastructure is a topic that is directly present in your GS paper 3. In fact, they use the term infrastructure, energy, ports, roads, airports, railways, etc. So it is very important component of national development and also from the perspective of exam. Now, from the reports, what they have mentioned is that the public expenditure as far as infrastructure is concerned has increased substantially from 2 lakh crore that was there in 2014-2015 to up to more than 12 lakh crore in 2026-27. So in a way, there is more than 6 times increase in the infrastructure spending. So let us take a look into what are the major areas where these amount has gone into. So in terms of mobility and connectivity, you can see that a lot of investment have been done in railways, in roads, in civil aviation, and in port modernization, in shipping, etc. So when it comes to railway, we all know that budgetary support has been increased, but the amount of increase is substantial. It has increased ninefold to 2.7 lakh crore in FY 26-27 from 2014. So the amount of increase is 2.7 lakh crore, 9 times increase has happened. Plus, we also know that several of the Vande Bharat and other kind of trains have been started, and also the railways have been used not just for passenger usage, but also for cargoes, right? In fact, there is another in India's indigenous automatic train protection system, Kavach, has been established, deployed to around 3,000 route kilometer. So what it indicates is not just we are covering more and more ground, but it is also done in a qualitative way. It is also done in a safe and protected way. Secondly, in terms of the roads infrastructure, India has the second largest road network in the world. And when it comes to the road infrastructure, particularly at the rural level, the flagship program is Pradhan Mantri Gram Sadak Yojana. It has connected 99.6% of the eligible habitation. So again, it's a very huge achievement. Apart from that, we all know about the increase in the national highways and all the state highways, etc. Third, civil aviation. So operational airports has increased from 74 in 2014 to 165 in 2026. So again, this shows a huge call it quantitative increase in the airports. And for this, there is another scheme called UDAN, that is Ude Desh Ka Aam Nagrik. It has connected 95 airports offering affordability and access. Then when it comes to maritime or the ports or shipping, again, a lot of things have been done here. We all know about Sagarmala projects, and major port capacity buildup has been done. It has nearly doubled from 873 mmTPA in 2014 to 1726 mmTPA in 2026. So again, we can see that port capacity has also increased. In fact, a series of laws have been passed as well to ensure that the governance of the ports is also modernized, it is also digitized, and ease of doing business, infrastructure and investment can be drawn from different countries as well. And then network of national waterways expanded from 5 in 2014 to 111 in 2026. So these are the development with respect to connectivity and mobility. Apart from that, so infrastructure doesn't end here. It also includes energy. It also includes other areas such as industrial and manufacturing clusters, logistics, housing, all these things. So when it comes to industrial manufacturing and infrastructure, so we have one of the major in scheme called Bhavya scheme, that is building hub for advanced and vibrant yojana for acceleration. So this envisages development of 100 new plug and play industrial parks. So plug and play industrial parks provide all the basic infrastructure which are required to operate in for any business setting, and this reduces the need for taking permission from government for basic connectivity, for electricity, etc. So in a way, it gives a lot of push for industrial advancement. Secondly, when it comes to logistics, India's rank has improved dramatically in the World Bank Logistics Performance Index from 54 in 2014 to 38 in 2023. When it comes to affordable housing, around 8.77 lakh crore allocated under Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana Urban, supporting affordable housing. Apart from that, you may have heard about the Swami funds. Swami. So basically, Swami fund is utilized for any low or middle class, middle housing which is currently gone, or which is under stalled, right? So this again is one of the important initiative. When it comes to energy security, this again India has done incredibly well. India's installed power capacity has reached 532.74 gigawatt by March 2026. And interestingly, India has already achieved its targets or commitments made in Paris Agreement under COP21. So it has sourced 40% of electricity capacity from non-fossil fuel a decade ahead of the schedule. And then when it comes to water infrastructure, Jal Jeevan Mission was launched to provide piped water to household, and from this has again increased from 17% in 2019 to 82% in June 2026. So these are the achievements when it comes to infrastructure. Now, what is the concluding remark? Are there any challenges? Yes, there are challenges. Challenges include when it comes to financial constraint, because infrastructure projects require a lot of funding, and government cannot be the only stakeholder which will provide financing. We also require financing from different other agents as well. Then there is problem of corruption, red tapeism. There's also problem of environmental impacts, because many of the projects, they have adverse impact on the environment. So there is a need for proper environment impact assessment, right? So development should be sustainable. It should not cause a lot of distress to the environment or to the people who are inhabiting there. So we need a comprehensive approach, including innovative financing mechanism. Some sort of innovation is required here. Effective governance is required to ensure that corruption does not take place, red tapeism doesn't take place, and community engagement can offer better benefits. So community can be told the importance of this, and affordable housing can be provided. So all these can be provided to ensure that the infrastructure project can lead to inclusive growth. So UPSC asked a question from this: investment in infrastructure is essential for a more rapid and inclusive economic growth. Discuss in light of India's experience. So again, whatever we have discussed, you can directly use all those points here. Plus, you can add some more examples. Right? Now, the fifth topic is again a very interesting topic. That is, this is taken from an article written by mythologist Devdutt Patnaik, and he has written that in Indian Express about the influence of Indian ideas across Southeast Asia. And this could be a treasure trove for your art and culture preparation, because it tells how Indian ideas, which include religion, political formation, languages, dance form, performance art, architecture, have influenced all these things in Southeast Asian countries, and they have given it. He has also given a lot of examples to substantiate those points. So essentially, the ancient maritime trade connections between the India and Southeast Asian countries have witnessed not only establishment of trading settlements. So basically, what is saying that it is not just led to the trading settlement or business growth, but it has also led to key trading settlements in power ports like Funan, present-day Cambodia, Srivijay, Sumatra, but also led to exchange of ideas. And the time span is from 500 AD to 1500 AD. Right. So let's take a look into what exactly has been the impact of Indian ideas in Southeast Asia. So first impact is seen on the language and literature. So Indian classical language such as Sanskrit and Tamil has greatly influenced various languages spoken in many of the Southeast Asian countries, such as Thai, which is spoken in Thailand, Khmer, Malay, Javanese, and Balinese, right? So they are borrowed extensively from Sanskrit, right? Not only that, the languages, but Indian epics such as Ramayana and Mahabharata also were translated and adapted into local literary tradition. In fact, if you have read this essay from S. Ramanujan, so he has written an essay called 300 Ramayanas or 3000 Ramayanas, in which he has said that the tales of Ramayana went into several countries, and all of them have adapted them into their own version, into their own local sensibility. So this in a way shows the impact of India's soft power even at that point of time. Secondly, so first is about the language and literature. Second is about religious adaptation, how religion adapted or how religion influenced the Southeast Asian countries. So temple complexes built by the Cham civilization of Vietnam, like Mai Son Sanctuary, was dedicated primarily to Shiva, with Sanskrit inscription and Linga worship. Angkor Wat temple complex that is there in Cambodia was originally dedicated to Vishnu, and Angkor Thom and Bayon temple later expressed Buddhist influence. So we can see here that the influence prominently is Hinduism and Buddhism. Then sites like Dwarati in Thailand reflect strong Buddhist presence, and plains of Burma, that is Myanmar, contain thousands of temples and stupas. Borobudur, a massive Buddhist monument built by Sailendra dynasty of Java, Indonesia, again it reflects how they have taken inspiration from the religious motifs or some of the religious themes of Buddhism and Hinduism. So these are the two major influences. Apart from that, there is also political adaptation, which means that they also took ideas from the political political ideas that were prevalent in India during that time, and especially the idea of God King or Devraj. So religion legitimized the kingship, where king was seen as God King. It echoed Indian ideas adapted to local political needs. So basically, in India, the king was seen as an incarnate of the god. So in a way, the king has absolute authority, right? And the king was supposed to do welfare of the people. So the idea of welfareism and the idea of absolute power was ingrained in ancient India, right? And that was essentially taken to the Southeast Asian country, but they were also adapted with local conditions. Then there was also the performing arts that were influenced. So graceful movements, intricate hand gestures, and storytelling of the Indian dance were incorporated in dance forms like Thai and Cambodian classical dance. They were taken from the Apsara dance. Music and musical instruments, including sitar, tabla, and mridangam, also found way into Southeast Asian musical traditions. When it comes to architecture, sites like Angkor Wat, Borobudur, and Mysore temples focused on Indic iconography and sacred architecture. Like we have the idea of Garbhagriha, right? So they also had these kind of architecture that were largely borrowed from Indian style, right? So these are the ideas that, in a way, impacted Southeast Asia as well, right? So here, this would be also very important for you to write in international relations, because if you look at India ASEAN relation, we talk about three C's: culture, corporate culture, commerce, and connectivity. So we know about commerce in terms of the free trade agreement, which is now being renegotiated. We know about the connectivity projects such as IMT Highway, about Kaladan multimodal project. Then when it comes to culture, we can understand that culture is a very significant force in India ASEAN, right? So this we can mention as a very important dimension when it comes to India ASEAN, or when it comes to Act East policy. Now let's talk about some important quick updates. So the first news is about Prime Minister of India, or Prime Minister Narendra Modi has surpassed Jawaharlal Nehru, the first Prime Minister of India, to become India's longest serving continuously elected Prime Minister of India. So a lot of articles have come in today's newspapers, Hindu or Indian Express. In fact, Mr. Nitish Kumar, Mr. Venkaiah Naidu, many of them have paid a lot of tribute to Mr. Narendra Modi when he has become the longest serving continuously elected Prime Minister of India. So in this context, yes, it becomes very political in nature, but at the same time, we should understand some of the mechanism, the static concepts of Prime Minister. Because remember, even though India has a parliamentary form of governance or democracy, the major power lies with the Prime Minister and not with the President, right? So some people say that India has a prime ministerial form of government because of the fact that Prime Minister has so much power. So what exactly are the various provisions of Prime Minister which is mentioned in the Constitution? Let's take a look into that. So Prime Minister's appointment and role is provided under Article 75 of the Constitution, which says that Prime Minister is to be appointed by the President, and the PM serves as the real de facto executive and the head of the government. Okay, so we have de facto means in reality, and de jure, which means that in legal terms. So in legal terms, President is the head of the state, but when it comes to the head of the government, it is the Prime Minister. So we follow largely the British system, but in the US system, the President is both the de facto as well as the de jure head of the government and state. Then what are the role of which is mentioned as part of Constitution? Advisory duties under Article 74, head of the Council of Minister to aid and advise the President on various matters. Then he also act as the principal communication channel between the President and Council of Minister, advise on crucial appointment, parliamentary sessions, and Lok Sabha dissolution. So generally we say that President takes this decision or that decision, but largely President takes decision on the advice of Council of Minister, and the Council of Minister is headed by a Prime Minister. Okay. Then the Prime Minister also serve as chairman of Niti Aayog, National Integration Council, Interstate Council, etc. Now tell me which other institution is the one where Prime Minister serve as the chairperson in the comment. Next topic is Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code 2016, where an important development has happened. Now Supreme Court has said if there's a conflict between the insolvency and bankruptcy rules and Supreme Court rules, the provision of Supreme Court rules will not be considered as superior, but instead the IBC provisions will be considered as superior. And the reason why Supreme Court said this is because it said that IBC in itself is a complete code. It talks about every aspect of appeal, about all the aspects, right? So it is very important for us to respect the provision of IBC, and Supreme Court should refrain from using its special power under Article 136 and 142. So this is the crux of the judgment. Now, what exactly is IBC? IBC was enacted to consolidate laws relating to reorganization and insolvency resolution. So when a company is not able to perform and it is going through operational losses, and it is becoming insolvent, right? It is not able to pay back its debt or to its employees, right? So a company becomes an insolvent, a person becomes bankrupt. So what should be the mechanism, how it should be dealt with? So in India we had a lot of laws, but there was no consolidated laws. So IBC essentially what it did, it consolidated all such laws and provided a framework for providing resolution to all such things. And it had four-fold resolve pillars of this code, in terms of it had an insolvency and bankruptcy board of India, which acted as the regulator, then insolvency professionals, which would manage the resolution process, information utilities, they will store and authenticate financial data, and the adjudicating authorities, that is NCLT, National Company Law Tribunal, and the companies or LLPs and DRTs for the adjudication part. That is why Supreme Court said that in case of any dispute, the IBC laws will be given more prominence. Okay. Next topic is about dark patterns. And a lot of reports have suggested that many Indian buyers keep losing a huge amount of money because of dark pattern, right? So maybe if you have ordered from Blinkit or Zomato or from any other source, you will find that there are certain deceptive design pattern where certain products keeps getting added, or some amount or some extra section gets added without the information of the user. Now this is something which keeps the user at dark, therefore it is called as dark pattern. Now it is a practice using in user interface or user experience to mislead or trick users to do something they originally did not intend or want to do. So for example, if you order from, say, a company, from Zepto or from Blinkit, and towards the checkout an additional products will be added without you adding it. So that is called as an example of dark pattern. So what are the patterns, key dark patterns? Basket sneaking. So automatic addition of a donation during checkout. So you may have seen Zomato has this kind of feature where Feed India features can be seen there. Confirm shaming, emotional messaging discouraging users from removing donation. Forced action requiring users to share personal information for subscription. So what is the guideline here? So yes, we have a guideline. So for this we have a CCPA, Consumer Protection Act is there, and there's guideline for prevention and regulation of dark patterns 2023 under the Consumer Protection Act 2019 issued by CCPA, that is Central Consumer Protection Authority. Next topic is coal exchange, where the Ministry of Coal has notified coal exchange rules 2026, and the purpose is to introduce coal exchange to improve transparency and to provide better price discovery, right? So this was part of an initiative undertaken by government under the Mines and Minerals Amendment Act 2025, and this has introduced the concept of mineral exchange. So what is this idea? So earlier the idea was that whenever there would be a purchase or some sort of selling of minerals or coals or anything, it would be done from a supplier, and it will be given to different companies which would be using that resources or the minerals. But that was again a non-transparent one, and there was a lot of problems with respect to price discovery. So what government did was that a mineral exchange was set up where the buyers and sellers of coal can transact, trade, and enter into contracts on an online platform. So in a way, this has made the paradigm shift by enabling multiple sales channels. So earlier there was one-to-one or one-to-many channel, where one means here that there would be a one producer or one supplier and many consumers, or the companies who would be taking it. But now there is many to many, which means that there can be multiple ways through which the changes can happen, the transaction can happen. Now, but not anyone can enter into coal exchange. For this, certain conditions are required. So what are the conditions that are required? First, the company has to be set up under Companies Act 2020, 2013. Applicant is demutualized. What is the meaning of demutualized? Ownership and management of applicants are segregated from the trading right. Third, the net worth of the company which is entering into the coal exchange should not be less than rupees 50 crores. Okay, so this is a development about coal exchange. Next topic is about epichlorohydrin. And now why it was in news? Because the Bureau of Industry Standards has put norms for the tea bags that we use for consuming our teas, right? But some of these tea bags have harmful chemicals like epichlorohydrin. So what exactly is epichlorohydrin? It is an epoxide in which one of the methyl hydrogen is substituted by chlorine. What are the application of this? Manufacturing of epoxy resins, synthetic glycerin, elastomers, etc. And what are the health benefits, risk associated with it? It is classified as a probable carcinogen, which means it can cause cancer, it can cause eye, skin, and respiratory, blood, and reproductive issues. So these are the harmful effects. That is why the Bureau of Indian Standards have taken this measure. Next topic is membrane cell technology. Now, the Environment Protection Second Amendment rules were amended, and now what it did was the caustic soda plants which were using this technology has to pass a test called as fish survival test. Fish survival test for wastewater toxicity during laboratory-based bioassay test. So basically what happens is, when a wastewater is released, right? So how do you measure whether it is, to what extent it is toxic? So what is this can be done by checking, can fish survive in the wastewater released or not? So this is precisely what is being done here, right? So this is the test is called as bioassay testing. Now bioassay test is intended to measure the combined toxicity of the wastewater that is released from the caustic soda plants. Now, what are caustic soda? Caustic soda, also known as sodium hydroxide, is one of India's most widely used industrial chemicals, and it is used to manufacture products such as soap, detergents, papers, textiles, aluminiums, and all other products. Now, what is membrane cell technology, which is important from your prelims perspective? It uses a special membrane to control the chemical process and is considered less polluting than older mercury-based processes. Okay. Next topic is land port management system. So here a land port management system has been launched as part of the Smart Border Initiative. And our purpose is that it will create a digital integrated and real-time management system for India's land ports. So India's land ports have become very important because they provide a lot of connectivity. They also they become a conduit for land-based trade, especially when it comes to India, Bangladesh, India, Nepal, India, Bhutan, or India, Pakistan even, right? So land ports are very important, but the problem is they're not very efficient. They're not connected to the different other ports such as seaports and other ports. So it is very important that it is also digitized and real-time data is provided to our security personnel so that they can detect any kind of untoward incidents and they can take preventive measures, right? So what is land port? Land port is nothing but an ICP, that is integrated checkpoint. It is designated area on India's international borders notified as a custom immigration checkpoint. Okay. Now, what is land management? Land port management system, and the name given is Vinimay. So it is a centralized digital platform developed by the Land Ports Authority of India to streamline and integrate operations for cargo processing and passenger movement. So both for cargo movement and for passenger movement it is used. Now LPAI is what is a statutory body under Which ministry? Under Ministry of Home Affairs, established under Land Ports Authority of India Act 2010 to develop, manage, and modernize the integrated checkpost, that is the land borders. Okay, land ports. Dust storm. So if you're in Delhi or nearby Delhi, you may have observed that there was a huge dust storm that was witnessed in Delhi yesterday, and the wind speed was more than 120 kilometer per hour. It gave a lot of relief from heat, but it also created a lot of dust pollution. So what exactly is dust pollution, dust storms, and how did it generate? What was the reasons for its generation? So a dust storm is a wall of dust and debris that is often blown into an area by strong winds from thunderstorms. So essentially here this wind speed was around 128 kilometer per hour, which was witnessed at the Pusa Center by the IMD. The wall of dust can be miles long and several thousand feet, right? And dust storm can often begin in dry desert areas, but their effects can reach far beyond the source. And in particular, the northwest India experience convective dust storms, locally called as Andhi, mainly during the pre-monsoon season, March to May, with peak frequency in May. Most affected areas are Rajasthan, followed by Haryana, Punjab, and Western UP, also Delhi sometimes, right? The last topic is battery energy storage system. Now, why this was in news? Because the Defense Ministry has approved the first ever 250 MW megawatt solar power project with BESS on vacant defense land in Uttar Pradesh. So what is BESS? So understand the concept behind BESS. It is an electrochemical setup that captures excess electrical energy and stores it for later use. So one of the problems in terms of the renewable energy is that they are not able to store energy, right? They're not able, because they can be utilized on the go, but when it comes to providing or storing energy, that's a very difficult concept. So for that purpose, you require battery energy storage system, and this is precisely what it does. It captures the excess energy and it stores for later usage. Now there are different types of BESS. One is solid rechargeable battery, which store energy in solid electrodes, example lithium ion, lead acid, zinc air, etc. And also we have flow air batteries, which store energy in liquid electrolytes. So the ones which store energy in liquid electrolytes are called flow batteries, and here it is circulated through tanks such as vanadium, redox, zinc iron, zinc bromine, etc. And it is considered as one of the distributed energy resources. DERs are small modular decentralized power generating systems located near the point of energy use. So this is all about today's news today. I hope this was useful to you. Make sure that you also attempt the questions that would be popping in front of your screen, and if possible, try to also comment about the answer that you have made. Thank you and all the best.